Hello, AP Biology students. We're going to go over the 18th section in Unit 3. And in this section, we're going to be wrapping up the steps of cellular respiration by talking about the electron transport chain. You might remember we already talked about the electron transport chain a little bit in something called the light-dependent reactions. This process is going to be very similar, but also have major differences than the electron transport chain that we saw in the LDR. Specifically, this is going to take place on the intermembrane of the mitochondria. Remember that the Krebs cycle is occurring here in the matrix, and this electron transport chain is going to be occurring all along the inner membrane here. And just like we saw in the electron transport chain in photosynthesis, we're going to try to make a dam or a reservoir of hydrogen ions. However, in this case, this hydrogen ion reservoir is going to be located in this intermembrane space. This is going to allow us to finally produce the main product of the electron transport chain, which is ATP. Remember that we ended off with the production of just a little bit of ATP and a lot of these molecules called NADH and FADH2. What's going to happen are these molecules are going to deliver their electrons to the electron transport chain. They're also going to donate their hydrogen ions to this space as well. Now, the electrons are going to move through this electron transport chain, which are, again, just membrane proteins. But basically, these electrons are going to move through this chain because each protein is just a little bit more electronegative than the last. This helps the electrons move along from protein to protein. These membrane proteins are also going to force hydrogen ions into this intermembrane space. And this is eventually going to create that concentration gradient that we need. Again, there's going to be a high amount of hydrogen ions in the intermembrane space and a low amount here in the matrix. After the electrons have traveled through the electron transport chain, their final electron acceptor is going to be oxygen. I think this is a test question on almost every AP biology test. What's the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain? And that's oxygen. Now, oxygen is going to combine with some of those hydrogen ions and the electrons to form water. If you remember, what was the first step of photosynthesis? It was water breaking down and forming oxygen. It's like a reverse reaction. Not an exact reverse reaction, but I like to show that the last step here was the first step in photosynthesis. So again, remember, we're creating this high concentration of hydrogen ions between the membranes and this low concentration in the matrix. And just like we saw in photosynthesis, we're going to see these hydrogen ions move through this ATP synthase. This ATP synthase is an enzyme that's going to make ATP. And it's actually going to rotate in place and bond a phosphate group onto ADP, making it ATP. These ATP synthase are again going to be found on the inner mitochondrial membrane. This type of phosphorylation is known as oxidative phosphorylation. This is the production of ATP by the movement of electrons through the electron transport chain coupled with the ATP synthase. So again, you can see this here, the NADH, FADH2 molecules are dropping off their electrons, which are used by the electron transport chain to force hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space. This creates a high concentration gradient in the inner membrane space and a low concentration in the matrix, which goes through the ATP synthase to make ATP. Now, for every NADH molecule, around 3 ATP are going to be produced, while for every FADH2 molecule, only 2 ATP are going to be produced. The amount of ATP produced for each of these molecules is calculated through data, so it's not like we're really seeing one NADH deliver its electrons and then 3 ATP pop out. There are just thousands of these molecules going to and from this process. It's just an average of the data. So let's now take a look at how many ATP are going to be produced at the electron transport chain. Remember that we produce 2 NADH in glycolysis, 2 in the prep step, and 6 in the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. That's a total of 10 NADH. And if you multiply it by 3, you'd get 30 ATP. Remember, we made 2 FADH2s in the Krebs cycle, and that's the only place we produce them, but they make 2 ATP each, so they're going to produce 4 ATP in all. We add these 34 ATP to the previous 2 and 2. This is where we get that 38 total ATP produced per glucose through aerobic cellular respiration. I just love this meme format. Yep, the electrons from NADH and FADH2, they're going to leave the hydrogen protons that are accompanying them, and they're going to go to the electron transport chain. Great.